Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Science Podcasts. This podcast, as you can see from the pictures, is on things that would disturb or disrupt biogeochemical cycles on Earth. So, we'll first look at the carbon cycle. Within the carbon cycle, we can identify a few natural events that disrupt the carbon cycle. The first one being forest fires, or really any sort of burning of plant material. So naturally, forest fires can increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but same can be said for stubble. Every fall, farmers burn stubble, and that will increase the amount of carbon dioxide. Also with forest fires, remember that if we decrease the plants, we also decrease photosynthesis. So that could also be a contributor to disrupting the carbon cycle. Another natural event is volcanoes. Now this is a little bit more severe, but just recently there was quite a large volcano that erupted in Iceland. These are photos of Iceland while that volcano was erupting. And you can see that with all the ash clouds, or all the ash in the air, it can really do significant damage to the ecosystem. It can increase the amount of carbon dioxide, obviously, that's in the atmosphere. It could also reduce photosynthesis by blocking out sunlight. So volcanoes are another natural event. Now we'll look at some human activities, a big one being deforestation. Deforestation is, of course, cutting down forests, and deforestation obviously reduces the amount of plants available for photosynthesis. When there's less plants, there's less carbon dioxide that's actually removed from the atmosphere. And human deforestation practices have changed, but we can still see areas like that within our environments. Fossil fuels are a big one. Fossil fuels that we burn produce carbon dioxide. Now we use them to heat our homes, but a very, very interesting study, and I just want to show you this graph here. This is a very famous graph that looks at global temperature and carbon dioxide. What we've noticed over the past 150 years or so is the amount of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere has increased significantly. Carbon dioxide is this red line right here. What scientists are starting to realize is that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is very closely linked to global temperature. So this is a global temperature fluctuation between years, and it's important to realize that as carbon dioxide increases, the general trend that we're seeing is that temperature is also increasing, and this will have dramatic effects on our environment. So what can we do? Well, obviously, we can reduce the effects of deforestation. Logging companies are now starting to plant more trees and shrubs, so there is a replanting effort. For us at home, we could recycle, reduce, or reuse so that fewer trees need to be cut down for our materials. We also can reduce the consumption of fossil fuels, and we can do this by some very, very easy ways. We can turn down the thermostat in the wintertime. We can add more insulation. We can replace doors and windows. We can do things to make our house more energy efficient. We can add alternative fuel sources or alternative energy sources. Now we're starting to see a lot more homes with solar panels. We're even starting to see windmills being put in as alternate clean energy sources. We can also reduce consumption of fossil fuels. Now, if we look at this table here, one of the interesting things is 2010, the fossil fuels that are present, by 2025, they'll be 60% less than what we have today. So we're running out, and we will run out before we have a chance to really replenish our fossil fuels. It takes so long for fossil fuels to be produced that we're using them faster than they're being made. So in saying that, we need to look at alternate ways to reduce consumption of fossil fuels. So some very simple things, obviously alternate modes of transportation. We don't need to take vehicles everywhere, so we can use other modes of transport. And if we did need to drive, we can look at other more economical vehicles. So rather than a very big pickup truck, if it's possible to get a compact or a subcompact car, we can even now buy hybrids, right, which are fuel, gasoline, and electric, and we can even go as far as getting electric now. We can do different things to limit our consumption of fossil fuels. So the next system we'll look at is a big one in Manitoba, and that's the nitrogen cycle and things that disrupt the nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen, while it's good for plants, in excess can lead to a lot of plants. And in particular, I want to direct your attention to some of these photos. These are photos of Lake Winnipeg. And what's happening in Lake Winnipeg is excess nitrogen is creating algae and these algal blooms here to grow very rapidly. And these blooms, a lot of this is blue-green algae, which is quite toxic, are causing problems in Lake Winnipeg. And some of the problems, obviously, if you've ever been to the beaches near Lake Winnipeg, sometimes they're closed because the algal blooms are quite prevalent. Also, the blue-green algae has got some toxins that are actually very very bad and can irritate skin. They can change the odor and the taste of drinking water, and they can even cause illness in humans. So it's a big concern. Lake Winnipeg is a dying lake because of the amount of nitrates and ammonia in the aquatic ecosystems. So when algal blooms crash, so when the algae dies off in the season, the decomposition that takes place consumes oxygen from the water. And this can cause fish kills, particularly in the wintertime where there is a limited amount of oxygen available because of the ice. Some significant sources of nitrates come from agricultural sources and agricultural industry. So feedlots, livestock operations produce large quantities of manure, and that manure, if it's not monitored, if it's not properly disposed of, can wash into lakes and rivers. Also, the use of fertilizers. So using fertilizers that may wash off farmland can end up in lakes and rivers. And this is a big issue for Lake Winnipeg because remember that the Assiniboine River and the Red River flood almost yearly. And so all of the nutrients that are present in the fields close to those rivers are in fact ending up back in the lake. Now, for people in rural areas, drinking water that's been contaminated with nitrates in excess can cause a condition known as anemia, which is a blood disorder, and it's very common or more prevalent in children. So human sewage and wastewater, that's another big issue. Large communities use sewage systems, and the wastewater is collected in underground sewers. In smaller rural communities, they use septic fields and septic tanks. And these are some examples of, this is a septic tank here and sort of how it works. And this is a septic field. Now the thing to note is that usually within these rural communities or these rural towns, there's also wells. And the septic field will act as a drainage for dirty water, but some of that can percolate down into the water table. which can then be pumped back up into wells. And this is where we can get some of the problems of contamination. So some things we can do, well, obviously we can make sure that holding tanks and septic fields work properly. That's a big one. For farmers, they can limit the use of fertilizers. We can monitor manure from feedlots so that we're not adding excess nitrates into the ecosystem. The other thing we can do is just make sure that along our rivers there's natural vegetation. So this is called a riparian zone, and it's the treed area around the river, and this acts as a buffer from the agricultural area, and that can limit the nitrates and ammonia that actually end up in lakes and rivers. So that concludes the podcast on disturbances to biogeochemical cycles, and I hope that was helpful.